We would like to express our gratitude on behalf of NUS Libraries to Dr. Medrano for organizing the previous talk on domestic medicine in the Malay world and the current talk. Dr. Medrano has also kindly agreed to moderate our event. Let me welcome Dr. Medrano to introduce Prof. Timothy Barnard. Thank you, Dr. Medrano.
Sure. See, perfect. Thanks so much, Gandhi, for that, for the welcome and the introduction, and for raising awareness about our biodiversity seminar series that we've got going. It's really my pleasure to welcome to the series and introduce our speaker for today. We've got Professor Timothy P. Barnard, who teaches in the Department of History at the National University of Singapore, where he offers courses that investigate the cultural and environmental history of Southeast Asia, as well as modules that dive into the specific cases of, say, Singapore and the Malay world. Professor Barnard really has a list of publications that kind of constitutes a wonderful library of the cultural and environmental history of the Malay world, with real probably specific interest in Singapore of recent, but it's just a fantastic, I think, range of topics that he's covered. Everything from Malay films, the great Achinese actor P. Ramlee and the Shaw brothers, to early modern Siak and its timber trade, the ups and downs of imperial creatures in colonial Singapore, and the hunt for Komodo dragons in colonial Indonesia. His vast sort of skill set, his storytelling ability, I think these are all just tremendous attributes of a great historian. And I think we're in store for another wonderful sort of talk today, looking at monkeys in the garden. It's my pleasure to welcome Professor Barnard, and I should say just very quickly that I've been sort of ghosting him for a number of years, and I'll go quickly into that. Ghosting me, basically, I've been sort of following him unconsciously. Professor Barnard got his training at Ohio University in Athens, Ohio. I worked in Athens, Ohio, at Ohio University in the Center for Southeast Asian Studies. He then went on to Hawaii, where he did his PhD under Leonard and Barbara Ndaya. I also went to the University of Hawaii and worked with Leonard and Barbara Ndaya. He then migrated across the big ocean to Singapore. And after a number of twists and turns, I too have made that same journey. So I've been sort of following him and sort of working within his wake. And it's been a great pleasure. We've become friends and colleagues, and now we share this island together. It's a real joy to introduce him and hear what he has to share about monkeys in the garden. So without any more delay, I'm going to pass it over to you, Tim.
Okay, thank you, Anthony. That's a nice introduction there. I would also like to point out, with regard to Singaporean history, the Ohio University connection also goes back to John Mixick and James Warren also went there. So we've got a long heritage and history of connecting to a university. A lot of people often don't talk about, but that's not what we're here to talk about. What we're going to discuss today, or I'm going to discuss, and then hopefully it'll raise questions and people will have other things they want to comment on and such, and I look forward to hearing that, is a talk about what occurred in the Singapore Botanic Gardens in 1971. And in that regard, what I need to do is, let me do all the various things I need to do. I'm going to take control of the screen, and then we can have a PowerPoint, which will show much more interesting photographs than you having to look at my face. So let me go to the old share screen thing, and then we'll get this going. Okay, so what we have here is the talk today will be about monkeys in the Botanic Gardens. In many respects, this will be the background slide throughout the talk. But what I would like to emphasize is this captures a lot of the pre-1971 atmosphere of the Singapore Botanic Gardens and what many people in Singapore associated with the gardens. And that was, as you can see in the photo, this is a family visiting with the resident troop of macaques. This was a very common recreational activity in colonial Singapore. And I'll discuss that in a little bit more detail to put it in the context so we can explain what happens to these macaques. But what I also want to do is talk about what the context of where this talk is coming from. And this is not only part of a biodiversity seminar series that the NUS Library is overseeing, but this is in conjunction with research that I have conducted with Jennifer Yip. She's a PhD student at the University of Pennsylvania, who one day will be joining us in the Department of History at NUS. And it's also part of what will become a chapter in a book called Singaporean Creatures, which I noticed some of the participants here are also providing chapters for that book, including Anthony. So this is just a kind of a shake of the finger to say, get to work on that. Turn those chapters in. But this is for a book that will eventually be coming out, which will focus on the stories of animals and history since World War II in Singapore. So if we're going to talk about monkeys, we need to think about what monkeys live in Singapore, how they have interacted with humans, and in general, their own background or their own history here. Now, Singapore itself has 3 native species of monkeys. There is the Raffles banded langur, or the banded leaf monkey, which you can see the picture on the top here. You also have the Sunda slow loris. Now, while both of these monkeys are resident in Singapore, they're extremely rare. I mean, you will not see them at all, and their numbers probably are less than 50 or 20 or whatever the numbers are. It's extremely limited. If you are familiar with monkeys in Singapore, of course, the main monkey you're thinking of is the long-tailed or crab-eating macaque. That's the one you will encounter when you go to McRitchie Reservoir or anywhere in Singapore. This is the one they're telling you not to feed when you see signs in the parks here. And there is a unique history to the long-tailed macaque in Singapore and how it interacted with humans, and particularly in the Botanic Gardens. But it's part of a larger history of monkeys in Singapore. Monkeys existed in colonial society beyond the forest, beyond these native species, and that was related to colonialism. Monkeys were a very common creature, if you will, in colonial Singapore. It was the monkeys, and by monkeys, I mean, you can take the whole range of species from gibbons to orangutans to baboons to macaques. Monkeys were the second most popular pet in Singapore, household pet, in the 1930s. People could purchase them from shops on Rocher Road or Northbridge Road, or they could even go down to the harbor and buy them directly from ships, if you wanted to, I guess, cut out the middleman. This is hard to describe or understand in many respects, because monkeys were just part of what made Singapore kind of a modern colonial city. You would try, I mean, these monkeys, of course, could not be domesticated, but they could be, we'll say, reined in. They had to be kept on a chain. They had to be kept in cages if you at your household, because they were so disruptive. Now, the thing is, monkeys were so common that it was just something you would own to show how you had mastered nature, but also society itself. On the right here is a picture of my recent book, Imperial Creatures, which on the cover features, this is an Australian soldier before the war who was stationed in Singapore, and his pet monkey. You can see the chain draping down from the neck there. Monkeys were a very common presence in colonial society. You would see them in house compounds. There are reports of people taking them, a bit like they do today with the little pet dogs. People would take them to cafes and things like that. They would take them out to the Punggol Zoo to visit their monkey neighbors or monkey relatives, if you will. There is even a report of a monkey attending a performance of La Traviata at Victoria Concert Hall in 1925. And the reason we have the report is a number of attendees complained because the incessant chattering of the monkey that was watching the opera. So someone took their monkey to the opera. The point is, monkeys were not only in the forests or other places, but they were also in the house. But the most common monkeys you would see in Singapore were those that were, let me get here on the, that were in the Singapore Botanic Gardens. The Singapore Botanic Gardens had 2 troops of macaques that estimated, there was an estimated population of them of about 100. The first troop was located in the gardens jungle. And if you're not familiar with the layout of the Singapore Botanic Gardens, the gardens jungle is near the bandstand today. It's kind of between the bandstand and the orchid, National Orchid Garden today. And the second one was located in the Economic Garden. Economic Garden is basically where the Botanic Gardens MRT station and NUS Bukit campus is. So there were 2 troops of macaques. The key one for us really is the one that was in the gardens jungle. Now, the ones that were in the gardens jungle were a tourist attraction in Singapore. People would go, it was the main thing that people would think of when it came to the Botanic Gardens. You would go to the Botanic Gardens, see monkeys, and you could feed them. You could buy peanuts or bananas right outside the main gate. You could go in, the monkeys would come up to you and you could feed them. And it was seen as just a wonderful exercise and a very positive experience. And it was written up in many of the tourist guides about Singapore as one of the few highlights of any visit to the island, in a sense, to think that you had gone to the Singapore Botanic, or to Singapore, you needed to go to the gardens and feed the monkeys. Now, this occurred with very little negative experience. There were very few reports of the monkeys getting out of hand or attacking people and things like this, but they did become habituated to being fed by the humans that visited the gardens and came to do that. Just as an aside, I was once working, doing some research on the Singapore Botanic Gardens, and my own mother-in-law asked me, "Oh, are those monkeys still there?" And I said, "No, that's been a while since that happened." But it's so entrenched, particularly in many older Singaporeans' minds, of that's what you did. You go to the gardens, and one of the main things you did at the gardens was feed the monkeys. Now, for this to be a real historical topic, we need some change to occur. We need to understand what's happening. And basically, these monkeys that were in the gardens were seen as a tremendous attraction. They were a tourist attraction in colonial Singapore. And as Singapore itself transitioned from being a colonial society to being part of Malaya, to being its own independent nation state, this relationship with monkeys on the island also transformed alongside these political and social transformations. For example, when we think about the monkeys that were pets in households, what happens when you move from a more open, we'll say an open designed kampong, or you have a house that has a lawn or a garden or a yard? What happens when you move into HDB? Can you keep a monkey in HDB? The quick answer to that, of course, is no. In other words, there's going to be a changing relationship as the larger society shifts and change. This also occurred with regard to the issue of public feeding. Before World War II, this was just seen as a wonderful attraction, a tourist site, no really negative incidents. You can only find a handful of them. After World War II, and then as the 50s took place, in the 60s progressed, reports began to build and grow up in which the monkeys in the gardens became labeled as pests. And this can be seen in many of the annual reports of the Botanic Gardens. In pre-war reports, they would just say, oh yeah, they would just note that there were 2 troops of monkeys in the gardens, not a big deal. Beginning in the 1950s, they started to be labeled as a pest. They were, first of all, seen as damaging to the plant beds. They would go and anytime the gardens tried to plant a new field or a bed, the monkeys would go in and just rip it up and eat through it and look for fruits and whatever to eat. And so therefore they were hindering horticultural activities. There was also an increased number of reports of the monkeys attacking workers and visitors to the gardens. Now, some of this was the macaque troop in the garden. Some of it, though, was because people would release their pet monkeys when they no longer wanted them or they had become too troublesome for their households into the gardens. And these released former pets could not, of course, integrate into the troops, or they weren't even the correct species. And so there was conflict between the monkeys, violence, the feeding was going on. And so there were, in a sense, just an endless list of complaints that began to arise in the 1950s and then throughout the 1960s. And so this leads to the question of, well, if we have these issues related to the monkeys in the Botanic Gardens, how do we deal with troublesome animals? Well, in Singapore, in a sense, the colonial answer to dealing with troublesome animals is to cull them. In other words, to kill them in a very public manner. This was the common practice for all troublesome animals over the entire colonial period. They did this for dogs, they did this for rats, they did this also for monkeys. You can see here on the left, this is a notice for dog killing in which the government could go out and kill, quote unquote, all dogs found straying in the streets, roads or thoroughfares, or beyond the enclosures of houses of their owners. And this was, in a sense, this was how you dealt with troublesome animals or bothersome creatures during the colonial era. And this is exactly what they did with monkeys. For example, just to pull one example out of the numerous ones that exist, in 1908, Henry Ridley, the famous director of the Botanic Gardens, wrote about a problem he was having with monkeys. He believed it occurred because a troop that had existed in Lower Grange Road had migrated into the gardens and therefore had come into conflict with the resident troop. And the conflict between the two troops had created a nuisance, and at one point, monkeys from the newcomer monkeys, if you will, attacked a worker. And so Ridley simply said, kill as many of them as possible. And he sent out workers with guns. He brought in the hunting club, and they all went in the gardens and just shot monkeys wherever they could see them. This was the colonial solution. It's violent, it's not very pleasant, but this is how they handled such issues. So Singapore is having a growing problem with monkeys in the gardens. There are increased numbers of reports of conflicts between the monkeys, people abandoning their monkeys in the gardens, of the troops seem to grow in size from the traditional 100, and that would create greater, of course, competition for resources. And so the Singapore Botanic Gardens turned to the traditional colonial approach of dealing with troublesome animals. They decided to cull them. And so throughout the 1960s, hundreds of monkeys, hundreds of macaques were killed in the Singapore Botanic Gardens. I have, just for 3 years leading up to our main event here, listed on the screen. In 1968, there were 47 reported kills in culling activities. 69, there were 27. 1970, there were 4. This occurred throughout the night. It really started getting ramped up in 1959 when Burkill became the new director of the gardens. He was the director from 59 to 1970. And he completely, this was his way to address the issue. And during the 1960s, as these culling activities are going on, as reports are growing of conflict and problems and issues, monkeys in the reports begin to shift from being a pest to being a menace. So in other words, the next level up in threat assessment. And as one newspaper writer described them, they were an army of scraggy, unkempt, underfed, and vicious animals. Okay, so we need to address, that we need to do something about this, the government felt. And so they needed to cull the monkeys in the gardens. And so while there had been culling activities occurring, as you can see, in 1968, 1969, 1970, they really took off and kind of came to their conclusion in February 1971. On the 23rd and 24th of February 1971, over those 2 days, the Singapore Botanic Gardens was closed from 6 a.m. to 2 p.m. It's one of the few times ever the Botanic Gardens has been closed. Public could not enter the grounds, but 20 SAF soldiers entered the grounds of the Singapore Botanic Gardens. They were supposedly marksmen, and they went into the grounds and began shooting. Now, there are no, at least I cannot find, Jennifer cannot find, accurate numbers for the number that they killed. One report says on the second day they got 12, but one of the accounts later on, an oral interview with someone who was witnessed all these proceedings, said that they were actually not that successful on the first day. They would try to shoot and the monkeys would scatter and go to the top of the trees in the jungle. They would get out of range. It was hard to see them. And so therefore, it's not entirely clear how successful this culling was that took place on the 23rd and 24th of February. But Army soldiers did enter and they did try to kill the monkeys. By the way, and things will start to go back and forth in the next few slides. They did the same thing again in March over one day in an attempt to clean everything out, and that didn't seem to go well either. The main thing that occurred to the two troops is they fled the gardens. They got out of town because people were shooting guns at them. One troop seems to have fled over to Istana Woodneck, or which some of us call Istana Tyersall, which is the Sultan of Johor's estate, which we're not supposed to go to. And the others went across the road to Dalvey Estate on the other side of the Singapore Botanic Gardens. Now, so in other words, they kind of migrated out of the gardens. This actually led to a bit of a problem for the government, because when the monkeys fled into Istana Woodneck territory, the Singapore Armed Forces couldn't go into this because that's foreign ground, or that's, it would not be diplomatically a good idea. And so they had to request approval from the Sultan of Johor to enter his property. And, you know, that took a couple of days. And by the time they got approval to go into the property, the monkeys apparently were at the very top of the canopy, and they just, it didn't work, main point. The other troop that fled into Dalby Estate created its own issues, because this was a housing estate, and frankly, fairly elite housing estate within Singapore. And you can't go around shooting a gun, you know, random within the estate, you know, trying to kill a monkey that may be at a, you know, on the roof of a house or whatever it might be. So the monkeys had sought refuge in territories on either side of the gardens. By the end of 1971, it seems the ones that survived the shooting, and then also what's to come, and I'll describe it in the next page or so, they eventually migrated to the central catchment area. So theoretically, the ones you may see at McRitchie Reservoir may be the descendants of those. That's not really clear, but the point is they kind of got out of that. By the end of 1971, they left, and the Botanic Gardens doesn't have monkeys. You know, as I told my mother-in-law, they haven't had monkeys in many decades in the Botanic Gardens. Now, that's, to me, an interesting story. There's something that occurred. The government went in, it used a traditional colonial approach to handling the issue. But what happened because of this is what makes it interesting, at least to me, because the government received a tremendous amount of criticism for this killing of the monkeys in the Botanic Gardens. There was I would call it a flood of letters to the editor of the paper, and I just have a couple of examples here. For example, Marymount Convent schoolgirls petitioned the government to, you know, like, please don't kill the monkeys. A University of Singapore student said, okay, look, those monkeys are out of hand. You know, all older Singaporeans will tell you, oh, my brother got bitten by one, or when they were feeding him in the 60s and such. But come on, there has to be an alternative to killing them, the student said. And God forbid, there was an actual protest in Singapore. And you can see a photograph of the protest, and we'll get into a few details of this, because there's several things that make it both uninteresting, but also unique and interesting. As you can see, it's for foreigners. And I mean truly for foreigners. These are not long-term residents of Singapore. These were for visitors to Singapore. The woman on the right is named Barbara Worrell, and she was here as a nightclub singer doing her act in Singapore, and she read about the culling that was, you know, she read in the newspaper that the Botanic Gardens would be closed today, essentially so we can cull all the monkeys. And so she and her agent and a couple of her friends go out and held up these signs. Barbara Worrell was a Hollywood celebrity in the sense that she starred at the time in a TV show called San Francisco International Airport, which, by the way, starred Lloyd Bridges. And so she was in town, I suppose, promoting it, but also doing her nightclub act. So they hold up these signs, and as you can see, the enthusiasm, particularly the two guys on the left, they hold up these signs, you know, why are you killing these monkeys, things like this. The police showed up, and the police said, you know, give me a break, you know, go away, get out of here. And that was the end of the protest. And this, by the way, was raised later on of, well, it's only the foreigners who are protesting, so it may be acceptable, things like this activities. But there was so much criticism of the government, and people were horrified at the killing of these monkeys, of these attractions that they had gone to the Botanic Gardens to interact with and feed. And they, in a sense, they may have been vicious little beasts, but they were beloved. And people were taken aback by this. And the government was a bit taken aback at people's defense of the monkeys. And they literally, and this is a quote from the newspaper, they hit back at critics. So they started saying, oh, what are we supposed to do? How are we supposed to handle this? We're trying to get rid of these pests and these menaces. They had the head of the SPCA come out and say, oh, this is acceptable behavior. But he was so hesitant in his promotion of the government that they had to come back with extra meetings with him, and eventually a spokesman for the SPCA had to come out and clarify his comments and such. And ultimately, the government did, as I mentioned, a few weeks later, go back in the gardens again and try to shoot him, and that apparently was very unsuccessful. That happened in March 1971. And then they had to deal with the issue of the monkeys being in Dalby Estate and Istana Woodneck or Istana Tyersall. Since they can't shoot there, it's not working. What they decided to do was slightly alter their policies, and that was they're still going to kill the monkeys, but they're going to poison them now. And so there are reports that in particular, like July and August of 1971, a number of dead monkeys are found on the road. So like on Tyersall Road, or I guess it would be Evans Road. People are just literally finding dead monkeys on the road. And when this gets reported to the government's like, oh, I don't know what you're talking about. Oh, this, you know, the head of the Botanic Gardens at the time, Alfonso, said, oh yeah, they must have been hit by a car. Later on in oral interviews, he said, oh yeah, the PPD, the Primary Production Department, came around and gave us poison. We put them in bananas and the monkeys ate them, and that was it for the monkeys. So following these shootings, following these poisonings of the monkeys, the ones that remained were the ones that then went northward to the central catchment area. Okay? So what we had was a reconfiguration of the human-animal space in the Garden City, in modern Singapore. Okay, monkeys had been a common presence in colonial Singapore, in the common urban space. Now they were to be taken out of this space. Okay, it was a transformation in the human-monkey or human-macaque relations. For example, and I don't really have this up on the screen, by late 1971, the government began to change the laws related to what could be kept as pets. So for example, you could not keep a pet that was considered to be a wild animal. And monkeys, because they can't be domesticated, are a wild animal. So you couldn't get, initially you had to register them, and then within a few years, they then just said, no, you shouldn't have a monkey in your house. Monkeys were wild and they needed to be in a wild space. In the Garden City, you manage that space. And so parks are for humans. The Singapore Botanic Gardens is essentially a park, a recreational space. So therefore, wild animals do not need to be in that space. And so this was a creation of boundaries, barriers, zones, whatever you might want to call it, to create human zones and animal zones. Now, the animal zone, the wild animal zone, would become the central catchment area, that central lung of our island, the central biome of our island, which provides filtration for our water, for the reservoirs, Upper Lower Pierce, McRitchie. It has most of our, at least untouched forested area, at least since it was replanted. And this is where wild animals such as monkeys were supposed to exist. And that's fine. Okay, we have a monkey space, if you will. We have a human space, and that is maintained. Now, this worked for a decade or so until we as humans began to encroach into the central catchment area. This came through such as the construction of the PIE, roads which bisected the central catchment area. We began to build condominiums on the edge of for example, Bukatima Nature Reserve, when we started to build condominiums or HDB flats on the edge of this area. In many respects, it invited or allowed for the macaques to, since we were entering their area, they were able to come into the zone. I know one of the speakers here, this shout out to Donna Bernero. I know she's had monkeys come in her house. She lives near the central catchment area. this became a common tale. And so then it shifted back to, how do we handle these monkeys? Okay. And the real question is, do we still cull them? Do we still use that colonial practice of dealing with them? The macaques in the gardens now, in many respects, are the macaques of the central of McRitchie Reservoir, of Fukutima, in a larger sense. And so how do we deal with these animals now that we're encroaching in those areas? Now that we have a pastime of going for walks in McRitchie Reservoir. As more and more people go into these nature areas, as that has become a recreation for many of us, we are intruding into their space. Now, to just do this very quickly, so the question really came to be, do we still cull nuisance animals? And the quick answer to that was, yeah, for the most part. There was an increased emphasis on trying to alter human behavior. So for example, signs like "don't feed the monkeys," which you'll see everywhere when you go to the nature reserves. That the photo you see on the left is from Coney Island. My wife took that photo and went for a walk there. The thing is, if you live in one of those condominiums, I'm sure you have received a flyer explaining, like, keep your rubbish, under lock and key, and, don't feed the monkeys and such, to promote this habituation of the monkeys getting food from humans. But there also continue to be questions of culling. Now, culling did occur, and it actually took off quite a bit from about 2010 to about 2015. And this was also still under the primary production department, which had then evolved into AVA, and our Singaporean love of creating new acronyms and new whatever to deal with things, to masquerade change. And the thing is, it still continued, but there was increased responsibility placed on humans. But by 2018, InParks took over the management of all animals, particularly wild animals in Singapore. And so InParks now says culling is the last resort. And this not only applies to monkeys, this applies to wild boars, even our beloved otters, crows, and other animals that are traditionally culled in Singapore. So now with InParks, they seem to be moving away from this, I'll say, colonial practice of the culling to control the population of these animals. Now, with that said, let's take a step back and think about monkeys, humans, and history. Now, by the way, this is a photograph of one of the people who found one of those. That's a poisoned monkey. It was found in mid-1971 outside the gardens. But monkeys have a history in Singapore just as humans do. They have been in Singapore as pets, companions, and foragers in the forest. But their interaction with humans has allowed us to understand not only their role in society, but how humans deal with various issues, government policies, how they perceive their place within Singapore itself, government, and the society at large. And so the monkey-human relationship is one of the many stories in a very biodiverse Singapore that we can explore. And so when we had, for example, just a couple of weeks ago, Fauzia was talking about medicine and medicine from the forests and how we understand that. That's another of these stories. There are many of these out there. They just need, you just need to find the sources. And the Central Library provides many of these sources. They are PDFing a lot of things or digitizing them, and the National Library is doing so. And so it's opened up a lot of opportunities for us to look at Singaporean history from new perspectives. And that's a good thing. And I will leave it at that. And I hope you have questions, and I'm more than willing to answer them. And let's start a discussion. So I'll turn it back over to Anthony and get off of this here.
Thanks so much for that, Tim. That was wonderful, and I think really rich, and provides a lot for us to both think about, but also maybe raise some good questions for you. And I like too how at the end you brought it back to kind of sources. How do we tell these stories? And you're right, the Central Library has it's kind of a big effort in terms of digitizing. The National Library, of course, there's the newspaper databases, and revisiting all of these things to kind of find and maybe pluck out and surface stories that haven't really been told, or at least vantage points that haven't really been explored, much like using the monkey as a point of entry, as opposed to something else. So lovely, lovely talk, and thanks again for sharing. Let's open it up for questions. I cannot see all 150 people, so
I will mention Gretchen Kaufman mentioned there are 68 Raffles banded languages. Because I said I don't know how many there are. So there's 68 if you're interested in that.
Great. Thanks, Gretchen, for that.
I imagine. Yeah.
I think Gretchen actually has a question. So Gretchen, why don't you turn your screen on? There you are. Fantastic. Maybe just introduce yourself really quick, Gretchen, like where you're zooming in from or something.
Okay, well, we're stuck at home, so I'm in Kent Vale. That's why you have the white behind here. And thank you so much for a fantastic talk. I've been meaning to email you, Timothy, and I'm an ecologist, a restoration ecologist, and I'm actually conducting a wildlife study at the Singapore Botanic Gardens.
Oh.
And I teach conservation biogeography, and so my students and I studied the Raffles banded langurs. So I know from Dr. Andy Ong, who studies them, that there are 68, she says, but it's always changing because of babies and whatnot.
And I'm sure there's some that have been missed, in a good way. In other words,
right. And then we can't study the ones at the military bases, blah, 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 like that. Yeah. But at least 68, she said. Okay. So I just wanted one comment besides that, and then I just have a really important historical question that I'm hoping you can answer about monkeys, because there's a fourth monkey species, or we call them primates, because I'm a wildlife biologist. So first, I have a series of, don't tell anyone because I don't want them stolen, but a series of wildlife cameras throughout a couple of wetland areas in the Botanic Gardens. Mm-hmm. And so I know there are monkeys there.
in the Botanic Gardens.
Absolutely. We've seen them on my field trips with the students, and we actually have caught them in a number of different locations on our camera traps, and so they're back. Okay. But they're in different places.
Don't tell AVA.
Different places than you mentioned, but I just wanted to say that's kind of a happy note.
No, I would have no problem with them returning to the gardens. I'm not, that was in many respects, to me, it's a very stark story, just to kind of explain this we're sitting down and we're making this a human controlled area. Mm-hmm. And
oh no, it has nothing to really do with your story. I just
but it's interesting to know that they're coming back. Let me I have a question for you. What's the fourth primate that I did not mention?
Right, so the dusky langurs. So about 10 years ago.
Dusky langur, okay.
Yeah, the dusky langurs, they're larger than the Raffles banded langurs, and they have like a white mask, so they're really easy to see, and their babies are orange, not white. So they're very, however, the two that we have are—
how many of those do we have, supposedly?
Just two. Okay, crazy story. So they swam over the Johor Strait in like November 2019 or so. I'd have to look up the date. Okay. And I'm not sure if anyone saw them swim. I'm pretty sure they must have seen them swimming, but we have all sorts of data that my students have analyzed on where they've been seen, mostly in the central catchment. Okay. So I can share that with you.
Sure, that sounds great.
But yeah, we have a fourth. And my question to you is, we can't figure this out. Even Dr. Ong can't figure this out. Were they historically here?
You mean, were they in the gardens itself?
Just in Singapore, historically.
Well, oh, you mean the macaques? Were they?
No, I know they were, obviously from your work, but the dusky langurs.
Oh, I didn't even know they existed, so I would have no idea.
I just was wondering if you had seen them in any of your research.
I have never, I mean, let's be very, when you're going back through these sources that Anthony and I are talking about, you don't really see a lot. I mean, it's not like there's a huge volume of monkey writings that we haven't come across. So I'll just say, I've never seen it, and I wouldn't know.
Okay.
Gretchen, I would just say too, just on the historical point, as Tim just noted, and then we'll go to a question from Stuart. In those older references, those older sources, the things that Tim's talking about and using, often you don't get that nuance of species diversity. It's a monkey. The way that it gets
But they look so different. They're
of course they do. But if you're like 1923 Singapore and someone is writing about a dead animal in the road, it's a dead monkey, not a dead or did that.
That's true.
Okay.
So
I'm gonna give up then. I just was hopeful that you had either come across it or you'd have an idea about.
No, I'm sorry to disappoint you.
But I would say, and then we will pitch to Stuart. I would say, Gretchen, go to the Biodiversity Library of Southeast Asia. This is a portal that's available on the NUS Central Library. They've got a lot of good material, scientific material that's historical, that's been digitized.
Okay.
You could put in your stuff there. And the other thing that I would mention is just the Natural History Museum. And there's great people there who might know the species history of primates in Singapore. So they too would be a good resource for you. Martin Lowe, for example, is somebody who works over there who's just extremely knowledgeable about all things kind of Singapore natural history. So
I'm sorry to take up so much time. I was just curious because we want to know if they're non-native or native, and is there something we should do about them, I guess. That was the reason I was asking. So thanks so much, you guys.
Good question. Thanks, Gretchen. Stuart, your turn. So we've got Stuart Strange who has a question.
Should I introduce myself?
Just, I guess, affiliation, maybe.
Yeah, I'm an assistant professor of anthropology at Yale and US College. So, Tim, excellent talk. I really enjoyed it. The question I wanted to ask was quite specific, right? I mean, obviously what you're describing is this transition, right? And you're really framing it precisely as this move to sort of, let's say, a post-colonial moment. Right, where precisely the thing that had defined a colonial institution is purged, right? And of course, the quote that you use highlights the fact that they're now being described as basically an army and a menace. And so one of the things, that really this bold question that I have is, to what extent are monkeys in this discourse about them being enfolded in what is sort of this emerging national security ethos, right? That is increasingly becoming to define Singapore precisely during those years.
Excellent. I got the exact answer for you on this one. There are reports that these monkeys in the Botanic Gardens are quote unquote useless and non-productive. They are literally not good Singapore citizens because they don't contribute to the, I've got quotes I can send you, but they don't contribute to the economy. They don't, they take food without working, they don't work for it. Unlike the monkeys that Corner had in the 1930s that they don't have the proper hands to help collect botanical specimens. So in other words, they're just kind of leeches or, on the government. And, why do we even have them here? And they're in there and they're attacking our children to boot. And so the damnation of the monkeys that occurred throughout the 1960s really frames it in the idea of they're not good citizens, they're not good residents, if you will, of Singapore. And that's why we had to get them out of this managed urban space.
So they're like the kampong residents as well.
Yeah, and they need to be eliminated for the Garden City. Absolutely. And if I might say so, I'm going to turn a question that someone asked in the chats over to Stuart, because this question asks, how do religious beliefs in the monkey god and Hanuman affect the human-monkey relationship in the culling exercises? My answer to that, although Stuart can answer this much better than I can, my answer to that was, at least in 1971, it made no difference. This was a government that didn't really care about the monkey god or Hanuman. This was a technocratic developmental state that was creating a managed space. And so that had no relationship. But there is a monkey god temple, there is belief in Hanuman within Singaporean society, and Stuart is studying that, so I'll turn that question over to him.
Okay, yeah, for sure. So yeah, everybody, I'm currently writing a book about macaques and the questions of control and religion in contemporary Singapore. So I suppose that's why Tim is turning it over to me. You know, that's a difficult question to answer because you have to kind of parse what you mean by, well, religious significance. And so the first difficulty is, I mean, so I'll answer it this way. When I talk to, so how should we say this? The people that actually have to deal with the monkeys, which is, I think, the import of the question, right? Now, what Tim is describing historically, these are Singapore Armed Force service members, recruits, right? It's going to be diverse, probably, you know, majority Chinese. Within the cults of the monkey god, who's one of the most popular deities here in Singapore still to this day, the relationship between the actual monkeys and monkey god is highly ambiguous. And so you get people who foreground that relationship, and you get people that are in some sense offended by even the question. And so, I mean, actually there's a sort of a deep history here. If you go and you look at the sources in Fujian, in fact, and this is what Chinese scholars say about the origins of the monkey god cult more generally, is that, right, there's this ambivalence that monkeys actually are perceived in some sense as a threat, and therefore they have to be sort of spiritually domesticated. And then, of course, when you get when you get the cult of Sun Wukong, Qitian Daseng, Tai Seng Yao, as they mainly call him here, layered on top of that, it becomes even sort of more complex. So from the perspective of sort of Chinese popular religion, it's highly ambiguous, and I don't think it really made any, it doesn't seem to make very much of a difference at all. Now, the other side of that question, of course, in terms of the recent culling, when AVA was in charge, right? It seems that a lot of that culling, and I'm sure there's some people here who probably know this, who are listening right now who know these things better than I do, but it seems a lot of the culling was actually subcontracted out. And so my sense is that a lot of those people that are actually doing it were probably South Asian migrant workers of various description. Now, when I actually talk to a lot of the South Asian workers who are the security guards that are on, right, so the point people that deal with actual monkeys coming out of Bukit Timah, for example, or Old Upper Thompson Road, it's quite interesting because a lot of people will say, well, they will actually sort of self-attest and saying, well, I'm a Hindu, we have respect towards the monkeys, but how it actually impinges on that is very unclear, because ultimately they don't really have much of a say in the matter. It's the condo residents.
As long as the bosses are there, you're not going to get much.
Yeah. And so, but I mean, even in India, this is a highly ambiguous question, right? There's sort of maybe a greater tolerance, but it's a tolerance that would probably also reflect, in some sense, some of the elements that we see more historically in Singapore that you already described, Tim, right? So then there's a question, there's still this fundamental question about, well, right, to see animals as sort of sacred and to understand that as sort of, how should we say, making them set apart, as in the classical idea, is quite complicated, right? And when it comes up against these kinds of technocratic imperatives, it becomes even more ambiguous still. So I don't know if this is the most satisfying answer, but that's the answer I have.
Yeah. Let me just run through, sorry, I'm gonna, on this, Anthony, because there's two kind of interrelated questions here from Jeff and Wei. The idea of monkeys being, what happened to monkeys, you know, they did try to capture monkeys, particularly in the 1960s, in the gardens, and they would be, if they were captured, they were given over to the university, which becomes NUS eventually, for laboratory research. The real problem they had, though, was capturing them. The monkeys got to know when someone was there, not to give them a banana, but to capture them. And they would flee, they would go to the treetops. And so much of the writing you read in the 60s is this frustration that they had with trying to capture the monkeys. And so that's why they eventually, instead of capturing them, decided to shoot them. Also, the question about the Penang Botanic Gardens monkeys and monkeys at McRitchie. I don't know. There must have been monkeys at McRitchie before '71. I mean, there must have been monkeys throughout the Central Catchment area. But the thing is, sources. I I never see sources on that kind of thing. And finally, and then I'll turn it back over to Anthony. Stefan asked about zoonotic diseases. They don't really ever raise that, particularly with the Botanic Gardens ones. In the 1950s, there was a trishaw driver that got bitten, who got tetanus from a monkey. And so there was a warning put out about, like, you know, watch your monkeys, but I believe the monkey was a pet monkey and not one of the ones in the gardens. But the only time I ever saw a diseases mentioned was the time in the 50s when the tetanus, a person got tetanus. And so in the newspapers, they said, watch out, monkeys are dangerous, you know. But it was just part of that larger trend of kind of transitioning them from pest to menace at the time. So you take it.
Oh, sorry. I think I Stefan, did you want to add anything else, or is that, did Tim more or less answer your question?
Yeah, I guess it's a question of sources, so I think this is the answer. So thank you. Thank you.
Okay, yeah. Great. We've got another question from Sharon. Sharon asks, are macaques innately aggressive, or has their past and present interaction with humans contributed to this behavior?
Well, I think I'm no primatologist, and so that's probably more for Gretchen or somebody else to answer. But from the report, what's interesting to me is that throughout the 30s and 40s, when you read about the macaques in the gardens, they were not seen as being overly aggressive. You could feed them, you could interact with them, people gave them food. Some of the aggressiveness that they had in the 60s was attributed to not only the release of pets. It is believed their population rose to be about 300 at one point. And as it got larger, there was a greater competition for resources. And, you know, let's just say you show up with a bag of peanuts and there's only enough peanuts for 10 monkeys there. Some monkeys are going to get left out. And so you had a variety of things going on, such as monkeys trying to integrate a troop, which would be unsuccessful. You had limited resources, you had growing populations of them. But I don't know if people also began to act differently toward the monkeys. There is a report of a kid hitting the monkeys with a stick. Like at one point, a monkey attacked a kid, and when they went to go investigate, the real solution was, well, hey kid, stop hitting the monkeys with a stick. And so there was, we'll say, aggressive human behavior also. Whether that's a change in, you know, what's going on in Singapore after the 40s or 50s, but are they innately aggressive? I don't know. You'd have to ask a primatologist for that one. Also, Stasha Wong mentions the role of acres. Acres did play a big role in the no culling, or culling only as last resort policy that developed. They became kind of the favored NGO for animal matters in Singapore. So they were very important in that transition from AVA to NParks. So yeah, yeah.
Tim, I wanted to see if I could just jump in with a question. Well, two questions
Sure.
very quickly, and we still have a bunch more that are kind of coming in, I think. One question I had was, so there's acres. I mean, in your story, I imagine if it was to carry forward up to the present, acres would become a sort of an actor in that story. Oh, yeah. But how about in the 70s and onward? Do we see Singapore Nature Society taking a position or having any role in that?
There really was not. The issue disappeared, I would say, for the most part, in the 70s and 80s. There was a few instances where someone reported like a monkey in McRitchie attacked them, and even the government said, yeah, we went and killed 3 aggressive monkeys. But it really didn't ramp up until the 90s or so. And that's with the construction of condos and other things near Bukit Timah, the creation of highways like the BKE, that split up the central catchment area. And so I would say the 80s was a relatively peaceful period for monkey-human conflict in Singapore, as each kind of kept to their areas. But so I haven't seen much about the Nature Society dealing with that, because at the time the Nature Society was also just trying to get its own bearings with its relationship with the government, and you know, their main focus was on things like Sungai Buloh and such. So yeah, there was a question from Donna Bernero about the trade in pets. And I'm more comfortable answering that because it's a historical question. Yeah. And she talked about, in a sense, if you were going to buy a pet monkey and you went down to the harbor, were there particular shipping companies that you would go to? Well, I don't know of any specific shipping companies, but what you would look for primarily are ships coming from parts of Indonesia. Because people would get gibbons from from Sulawesi, they would get macaques from Java, even orangutans from Borneo or Sumatra, and bring them in. And so this was a way that sailors could supplement their income. They would bring in exotic birds or monkeys or any type of animal that may be desired as a pet. And you could buy them from people, and it was just a way they could, you know, work on the side, you know, to add to their, you know, pocket money. And apparently, many of the sailors on the ship would go together in a group, which would then alleviate concerns of you invested too much money in buying, for example, a gibbon in Sulawesi that died before you could sell it. If you split up the costs, it made the problems inherent in that less problematic because you were spreading it out.
Could I ask a follow-up, probably connected to Donna's question? When do we see these kind of live animal markets disappear? Like particularly the ones that would maybe sell the monkeys.
Well, the thing is, these animal markets existed up, you know, they began, and who knows when, sometime in the 19th century, and they were on the ships, and then they transitioned more into actual shops by the 20s and 30s, and that's when you could go to Rocha Road. The government, and Fiona Tan has written a very good chapter about this in the book Nature Contained. But basically, the government was going to set up a wild animal market where you could go down to like Telok Air and buy a monkey or buy a bird of paradise or something. And that didn't go very far in negotiation. You know, they set up a committee to look into it, and it went nowhere. And then they also then tried to regulate those pet shops. And it became an issue about cruelty. You know, can you have monkeys in these pet shops, and where is that line, and what do we consider cruel behavior? And so even when the government would send down people from the veterinary authority to check out these pet shops, they would all get like thumbs up, and then people in the press would go, "Are you kidding me? Those places are terrible." Mm-hmm. And so it was just a common point of contention between a number of groups in the 20s and 30s. And then I think just after the war, those kind of became less and less prevalent. And then the government regulations came in, and by 71, they're just really clamping down on that.
I see. Yeah. Thanks, Tim. We've got a question here, if you can see it, from Aikwa. It seems, so Aikwa is a fan of birds, worried about more monkeys. Ikwa, yeah. Oh, Tikwa, sorry. Tikwa is a fan of birds and worried about—
He gets the monkeys coming into his apartment on the 9th floor. Wow, wow. They had to install grills to make sure they don't raid their kitchen and steal their eggs and eat our baby birds. Good Lord. Okay, wow, yes, then do put grills up on your windows. Yeah, but this is part of the issue, and this became a big deal with the government would have to send out people to run, what would you call those, like community meetings, and discuss things, and put a grill on your house, have rubbish bins that are not accessible to the macaques, and things like this. It's part of this conflict. And this is where aware plays a big role. Aware goes out, does a lot of, no pun intended, awareness activities. Not aware, I mean acres. Aware does different awareness activities. Acres goes out and promotes a lot of these human-animal relationship activities, trying to find the thing. So, I'm going to just say, yep, there's not much I can comment on that.
Yeah.
Hope your birds are okay.
Let's see, do we have any other questions for Tim? Tim and monkeys?
Maybe I can just ask another question.
Jump in,
Hi,
Donna.
Tim.
You can tell us your own monkey stories.
Oh, I've got lots of stories, but anyway, 4th floor, we get monkeys in every window that's possible. So we have grills and mesh. That's Upper Bukit Timah. A question about people bringing monkeys, pets to places like cafes. Did you ever come across any publications talking about etiquette? If we're looking, you think in the present
the thing is, yes. Okay, a couple of things about this. It seems, of course, I don't know why I'm saying of course, but the people that usually adopted these pets were usually Westerners, it seems. They would get these monkeys and they would take them out, and it was cute, and they would have them on a chain. They take them out as a companion, and there are stories of seeing them in cafes where 2 people who had pet monkeys would take them, and the monkeys could interact, have a play date. Or it was very common to read of people who own monkeys going out to the Punggol Zoo, which was out, of course, in Punggol. And taking your monkey out there, and it was considered quite enjoyable to take your monkey out there and let the monkeys see the monkeys that were kept in the cages there. It was just a very strange colonial aspect of the culture here at the time. So, and of interest related to that ethnic component to monkey ownership, when the Botanic Garden, when the culling occurred in 1971, there was actually a discussion in Parliament about this. And one of the speakers in Parliament said, I don't know what you guys are all getting in a huff about, because it seems it's only English speakers that are in a huff about this. The Chinese press is covering this culling kind of in a ha-ha manner, particularly the reaction of the larger community to what's going on. And so it introduced this, it was just a brief comment on the side within the larger parliamentary discussion of this, but it was this idea of, oh, this is only something the elite cares about, or the English-speaking elite cares about in Singapore. And it became a way for them to dismiss concerns about that, just as the protest was led by 4 foreigners. Literally foreign, visitors to the island.
Thanks, Tim. I think Gretchen's got another, maybe a pair of questions.
He has a question about owners' monkeys, but yes, go ahead, Gretchen.
I was hoping you'd talk about him, and you mentioned him briefly, but I was just wondering, since you're a historian, you know a lot more about that than I do, and I thought people might be interested in hearing about. And I'm a botanist, so I hire tree climbers. Like this tree right behind me is an endangered swamp cypress that I work on in Laos, and we don't hire monkeys or train monkeys to do that. People climb it, but I was just so curious about what he did and how he did that. And I also heard that one of them attacked him at the end. So.
Yes. My main recommendation, this one, and this is a promotion, buy Imperial Creatures and read the last chapter. But with that said, the Corner, EJH Corner was the deputy director of the, thank you, Donna. EJH Corner was the deputy director of the Singapore Botanic Gardens in the 1930s and a bit through the 40s. And Corner was a, thank you, Anthony. And Corner was a botanist, and he bought some monkeys when he was up in, I believe it was in Terengganu, or it was up near the Thai border, or Kelantan, I think it was Kelantan. He bought some monkeys that were up there. It was a macaque species, but not the macaque species that's in Singapore. And he brought them to Singapore, and these monkeys had traditionally been used to go up in trees and, for example, to pick coconuts. And I have personally said, when I used to live in Sumatra, my yard had a coconut tree, and a guy would come by every few months, and his monkey would go up and pick coconuts. And then the guy would give me, a couple thousand rupiah as my cut for allowing him to harvest from my yard. But the point is, these macaques were trained to, and you could talk to them and say, like, go to the one on the right, go to the one on the left, and such. And Corner can transform this practice into using them as botanical collectors. And so the macaques would go with him into the forest, and he could, it allowed him to collect specimens in the canopy that prior to this were inaccessible. And so it helped transform his research. And these were glorified civil servants. There were stories about them in the press in the 1930s and 40s. And they were wonderful contributors to science and colonial knowledge in Singapore. And then right as the Japanese were invading Malaya and Singapore, one of the monkeys attacked Corner and ripped his arm up, attacked his assistant. The Corner had to go in the hospital. And so he had that monkey's teeth filed down, had it kept in a cage. And then after he got out of the hospital and the Japanese are literally like coming over the causeway, he went out and released the monkeys to the garden's jungle. And then he went up to that specific monkey and shot it and killed it. Mm-hmm. And the other ones came back and actually were adopted. Most of them came back and were adopted by Japanese soldiers during the war. And that's kind of the end of that story. But the thing is, those were different species of macaques than the ones.
Pig-tailed macaques?
Sorry?
Were they pig-tailed macaques?
They were, the species name was, I believe, Mimestrina or something like that. Okay. I can send you.
Curious. Thank you. That was a great story. Were the slow lorises, the other two primates, were they ever
Never
in the journals that you read?
They in a sense don't exist in Singapore. And I'm also getting a thing. Donna's holding up that book. Anthony held up the book. I'll hold up the book. If you want a copy of
maybe have my department,
and you want a discount, you can go to NUS Press and type in Barnard 20 and you get a 20% discount. So
wow, there you go.
Why
not? Awesome, because my office is next to the NUS Press. So
well, then just go over there and knock on their door.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Oh, we've got your book is everywhere, Tim. Look I think everybody, if you've got the book, let's put it up now.
Oh, wow. I'm going to have yacht money the way this is coming in.
I think Stuart might have his right there. Yes, Stuart has. Okay. Very great.
Available in NUS libraries.
Oh, look at this. We've got Jeff also has his.
Or just get the free copy in the NUS library. Right. Although, I didn't hear you say that.
I hope there are a couple people that hadn't heard the story. Sorry, I didn't realize it was.
No, I'm sure there's
some. It's a good story. It's a good story.
Let's see. Any additional questions for Tim, monkeys, or Singapore environmental history?
Yeah. Sorry, can I just chime in here?
Please. Yeah, Jeff.
Just maybe
go ahead, Jeff.
Just one general question. I know maybe this is a bit not a very good question, but if you really had to try and pigeonhole your crab-eating macaques, would you consider them domesticated or wild, or
I consider them wild. I don't believe they can be domesticated. If you have to keep a chain around a monkey's throat or keep them in a cage, they're not domesticated. And at the end of the day, they may be, they may live in the household, but there are reports in the 1930s about people who were complaining about monkeys as pets, and they were going like, what are you thinking, basically? And this was in the press because they were just described as completely troublesome in the thing. I've got it written down here somewhere. They were infamous for, this is from the paper Jennifer and I are writing, they were infamous for examining and tossing about all property weighing less than a picul and placidly wandering the roofs of homes or even your neighbor's fruit trees. Most owners quickly learned this fact and kept the beasts in cages or attached to chains that allowed limited roaming within the confines of a household. Now, this is a quote. From all practical points of view, there is not much to be said in favor of keeping a monkey as a domestic pet. And if harmony is to be preserved in the home, there has to be a good deal of give and take between the people who share it. And a monkey is less a respecter of persons or property than any other animal. So don't put a monkey in your house, come on.
Well, they may not have been, maybe perhaps they haven't been bred to be sufficiently docile yet.
It is, yeah, they're not one of our lovely, limited number of animals that have actually been domesticated.
Tim, I was just going to say to answer that. I mean, there's a fundamental problem that they like to distinguish in the literature, right, between domestication and taming, right? And so the big problem is that monkeys, particularly macaques, are classically there's an excellent article by Agustin Fuentes about precisely this in an edited volume that was in 2007, right? But he talks about this more in terms of what he calls domesticatory practices, right? Because there's a lot of question about what we mean by domestication. It's not a coherent term, as I'm sure you're aware. But then the big issue with the macaques is that normally when you do define domestication, it has to do with the intergenerational control of reproduction. And that's precisely what you don't do with these monkeys, right? You capture them out of the wild like any other species, like elephants as well, right? And then you bring them in and you try to get them to adhere to a particular expectation.
You mentioned, Stuart and I had lunch a couple of weeks ago, and he was talking about the troop behavior in the sense of kind of the dominant male and how the troop is constituted. And in a sense, you can't really be the alpha monkey in the relationship and have like a monkey in your house. It just doesn't work. Just doesn't work at the end of the day. So.
Thanks, Jeff, for your question. Thanks for adding to it as well, Stuart. Let's see, do we have maybe anybody else? Any other questions? Last few questions for Tim. I've got one which is completely unrelated to monkeys, and maybe we'll call it a day after this question. Okay. Okay, so you've done monkeys, you've looked at Komodo dragons. I know you're working on mosquitoes.
Mosquitoes, yes.
Yeah. What Singapore creature would you like to do if you haven't done yet? What animal in Singapore interests you that you would like to tell a story about but haven't yet done it?
It's a good question. Javan mynas probably at the end of the day, but our good friend Fauzia is working on a piece about singing birds in Singapore, and that's kind of that story too. But that's about mosquitoes is my next one, so that I'll be working on. So I can't. Beyond that, maybe I'm getting smaller and smaller. So I don't know, maybe I'll go to microbes or something.
Well, thanks so much, Tim, for sharing with us today, and just for both for the talk, but also for kind of all the information that you bring, the cultural, the environmental, the political information. I mean, you weave it all so nicely in a story, and I think it's a huge contribution to understanding where we are in Singapore and Singapore's past, and how that past in many ways shapes what we do and how we think today. So thanks for a great talk. Thanks for everybody attending and sharing and asking questions. And I imagine if you have any additional questions or follow-ups, you can email Tim. His email is out there somewhere on the web, so you can find it. But that's it. Yeah, fantastic. Thanks again. Everybody stay safe, be well, and I guess we'll be in touch when we have another biodiversity seminar series talk, which I don't know when that'll be, but it'll definitely be after the lockdown or whatever we're calling this. Yeah. So thanks again, Tim. It was wonderful.
Okay, thanks, Anthony. Appreciate it. Thanks, everybody, for attending.
Thanks, Tim.
Thank you all.
Thank you.